With the rending of the shells from the Schleswig-Holstien, the world's bloodiest conflict erupted. In the dead of the Polish night, the steel behemoth pummeled the neighboring peninsula and signaled the inevitable death of millions. When the German Marines entered the depot of Westerplatte, the first gunshots of the war rang out, and the first of those millions fell. Across Poland, the Wehrmacht swept through the countryside while the Luftwaffe bombarded cities and terrorized their inhabitants. Town after town after town fell, and by the end of the week, the Germans were surrounding Warsaw. But in the north, those first signs of monumental conflict had yet to produce victory. When the white flag finally did wave, more German corpses were strewn on the Baltic coast than Polish ones, and the survivors were shocked to discover that such a small, under-equipped force could hold off the world's greatest army for so long. Truly, if the Germans had continued to stumble and retreat like they had at Westerplatte, the fiery specter of World War II may have been snuffed out in its first months, coming to us through the pages of history as a footnote. Today, we will be looking into the first battle of World War II, the Battle of Westerplatte. In this video, we will be taking a look at the context and lead up to the battle, and by extension the war, the tactics and positions of the various forces, their strengths and weaponry, the commanders, and of course the battle itself. Combining historical accounts, on-the-ground footage, and maps, I hope to shine light on the battle from every aspect, everything from the thoughts and literal points of view of soldiers, all the way up to the maneuver maps from above. We will end the video by looking at its conclusion and seeing if we can hone in on some valuable takeaways from this battle, both as a moment in combat and a symbol of determined struggle. But first, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content. Since this video mentions certain political factions in World War II, it's going to be throttled by the algorithm, so everyone sharing this video or subscribing helps a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and now back to the video. And if you're looking at how long this video is and think you don't want to watch the whole thing, that's totally fine. I get it. If you just want to see how the battle took place, this video is chaptered, so you can skip to that point in the video and you can just watch the 10-minute version of the battle itself. Since Westerplatte was the first battle of World War II, the lead-up and context to it is the same as the wider war. Since that is so well known, I won't go too much into detail here, but I will get more in-depth with the specific situation in the Baltic coast of Poland. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the League of Nations decided to redraw the borders of Europe and break up the empires that had lost the war. Germany, of course, was the prime target given the damage it had inflicted on France. Despite not really starting the war, Germany faced the brunt of punishment from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, being forced to accept responsibility for starting the war, paying a massive amount of reparations, demilitarizing, and, perhaps most importantly, having its borders changed. Alsace-Lorraine went to France, and Saar to the League of Nations, while Belgium, Denmark, Lithuania, and Czechoslovakia all got small pieces of territory as well. But by far the largest chunk of German territory that was lost was the long-lost country of Poland. Poland as a country had existed since the early Middle Ages and had flourished during the Renaissance, not only boasting the largest export of grain in Europe, as well as a powerful parliamentary body and a process of electing kings, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was also the largest country in Europe besides Russia. But the country would decline by the late 18th century, and by 1795 the expanding power of Prussia would collaborate with Austria and Russia to wipe Poland off the map. By the late 1800s, Prussia would unify Germany into an empire, and increased attempts to Germanize the Polish population would begin, but the Poles stood strong in their nationalist fervor. In the late days of the war, notable Poles got the ear of American President Woodrow Wilson, and with Germany's surrender, Polish leader Józef Piłsudski took control of Warsaw and the nation was reborn. While Poland would have to fight 6 wars to fully secure its independence over the next couple of years, the League of Nations was supportive of asserting its western borders. From the former German lands, Poland gained back Poznan, West Pomerania, as well as parts of Silesia and East Pomerania. This left a couple oddities. One was that East Prussia, still German, would be cut off from the rest of the country by a Polish corridor, giving the newfound country access to the sea. The other was the city of Danzig. Danzig, now known as Gdańsk, was a city on the South Baltic coast that had alternated between the hands of Germanic and Polish entities for centuries, often retaining high populations of both groups historically. But by the end of World War I, upwards of 90% of the city's inhabitants were German. Even for the vengeful League of Nations, giving the city fully to Poland was untenable, so they settled upon an odd solution and made Danzig an independent free city, consistent with a trend of free cities in Central Europe historically. They also tried this with Jerusalem in Israel, and as we all know, that worked out perfectly well and there were no issues. On paper, Danzig was politically closer to Poland, since the country was subordinate to the latter with customs and foreign policy, and Poland controlled the rail lines and its own post office in the city. This only strengthened in 1925 when the League of Nations granted the peninsula of Westerplatte, a former spa and coastal fortress, to Poland for use as a limited military depot. But in reality, Danzigers were far more in line with German politics, and the city's Senate was democratically controlled by the Nazis in 1933, the same year Hitler rose to power. Tensions ebbed initially as Hitler actually took a softer stance to Poland, entering into a non-aggression pact, but by 1939 tensions had significantly ramped up, and the Poles began to prepare for war. Westerplatte was not a terribly defensible position. For one, it was tiny, only about 0.6 kilometers square. Secondly, it was isolated from Poland proper, with the closest connection to Poland being the Hel Peninsula, 14 miles to the north by sea. And of course, there were the pesky regulations put in place on Westerplatte. Being a depot, its job was simply to store and transport military supplies for Poland, and as such everyone agreed it didn't need a large troop presence. The peninsula's force was capped at 88 men, 2 officers, 20 NCOs, and 60 privates, most of which were trained on machine guns and some on artillery. No fortifications were allowed to be constructed. This, of course, was not strictly followed, and the development of barracks and guardhouses began after 1933 in secret. The same year saw a public attempt by Poland to install a larger garrison as well, but this was condemned and the Poles backed down. But by 1939, war was imminent. Germany was given control of the territory lost to Lithuania not far away, and Austria and Czechoslovakia were incorporated into the Reich, despite claims by Hitler that the latter would be left alone. Westerplatte once again increased its defenses covertly, digging ditches and setting up barbed wire barricades. Soldiers had to be discreet and would incrementally fell trees at night and hammer stakes under blankets. The number of soldiers also swelled massively without the Germans noticing, as the soldiers would march into the base, but instead of leaving, they would dress the civilians up in military uniforms to appear as if they were coming and going regularly. The soldiers would remain in Westerplatte, and the next day a new group of soldiers would enter the depot with the disguised civilian workers, repeating the trick. At the same time, Germany drew up its plans for war. Westerplatte was actually a small part of the plan, but it was one of the first points of initiation. False flag attacks would be carried out on the Polish border as a justification for war, then German bombers would attack key military targets in civilian centers in Poland proper. The main invasion effort was split into two parts, with the creatively named army groups North and South operating in their respective domains. South, the larger of the two, would attack eastward towards Łódź and Kraków, as well as sweeping north to Warsaw. Group North would attack from Germany proper and East Prussia, with the former cutting east across the Polish corridor, and the later joining halfway with it, as well as pushing south towards Warsaw. Attacks on Westerplatte and other Baltic targets were generally insignificant to the wider invasion, but served to fully secure the region nonetheless. Danzig, while not having a real military, did have a militarized police force and an SS unit trained by the German SS, and this would help to attack Westerplatte and the Polish post office, as well as secure rail lines running through the Free City. Poland, meanwhile, actually took a less tactically sound approach for political reasons. In the event of war, France and England were supposed to help Poland and invade Germany themselves. However, in the years and months beforehand, the Allies had been hesitant to escalate conflict, often giving Hitler what he wanted and opting for appeasement diplomacy over military action, most notably with the Sudetenland. As a result, Poland opted to protect its borders rather than organize around geographically defensible areas, as they feared that England and France would grant Germany the most important regions of Poland as part of a peace deal if they came to control them militarily. If this happened, Poland would lose its access to the sea and main industrial centers. Poland didn't necessarily hope to win a war with Germany, but rather hold out on the borders long enough for France and England to attack and force a favorable peace deal. On Westerplatte, the orders of the garrison were to hold out for a maximum of 12 hours before either being evacuated or relieved by friendly Polish forces. The Germans, on the other hand, planned on starting the conflict here with overwhelming firepower. The main firepower for this would be a German battleship that was docked in the harbor under the guise of a visit to Danzig, a common occurrence at the time. While initially it was supposed to be a cruiser, the Germans decided to send the battleship SMS Schleswig-Holstien on August 25, 1939. While docked, the battleship aimed its guns at Westerplatte in a menacing yet seemingly harmless gesture. The invasion of Poland was actually scheduled to take place on August 26th, but Hitler himself delayed the war for fear of English and French invasion and Italian hesitancy. Some skirmishes actually took place on this date since not everyone got the message, but these were quickly reined in. Hitler resolved to continue, and the war was rescheduled to start on September 1st. To create a justification for the war, the Germans carried out Operation Himmler, where the soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms and attacked the German radio station at Gliwice near the border on the night of August 31st. Claiming that the Poles had struck first, the Germans proceeded to invade the country. At around 2:30 a.m. on September 1st, the German Marines disembarked the Schleswig-Holstien and landed on Danzig territory, ready for their signal to attack the depot. The actual first combat actions of World War II are disputed, since Operation Himmler is generally considered a separate incident. German planes as well as land forces moved over the border all at around the same time, but the most likely first impact of the war was felt in Tczew, not far from Gdańsk, where German bombs fell on the city at around 4:30 a.m. The German fighting force was significantly larger and had way more firepower than the Poles at Westerplatte. If we look at the German factions first, we actually see a few different groups at play, utilizing sea, air, and land assets. Starting with the land, we see that the Germans deployed three groups: the Danzig Police, the Marine Stoßtrupp Company, or MSK, and the SS Heimwehr Danzig. The MSK was an elite team created the previous year, and they served as the Marines of the German military, deploying alongside the German Navy, also known as the Kriegsmarine. These men had seen some combat before, but not very much. Nevertheless, they were well trained and equipped, and led by Lieutenant Wilhelm Hensingen. Operating on foot, the MSK operated in much the same way as the Weiter Wehrmacht. The SS unit here was actually native to Danzig and started earlier in 1939 with help from Himmler himself and the German SS, and later in the war would be incorporated into an elite German SS unit. They were led by Lieutenant General Friedrich Georg Eberhardt, who was the main leader of the infantry component of the battle. The basic unit size for German infantry was the infantry squad, which in 1939 consisted of 13 men, a squad leader, a deputy squad leader, a 4-man machine gun crew, and 7 dedicated riflemen. All of them wore the same gray uniform and steel Stahlhelm helmet, providing some level of camouflage and protection from shrapnel and debris. 11 of these men were also equipped with the standard issue rifle of the German military, the Mauser Kar-98K. A bolt-action rifle, the Kar-98K was chambered in 7.92 by 57mm and was fed with 5-round stripper clips. The rifle was actually a carbine with a relatively short barrel of 23.62 inches. Squad leaders did not yet carry submachine guns at this point in the war. Along with the rifle, soldiers carried the standard S84-98 bayonet, sporting a single-edged 10-inch blade, as well as 45 rounds of ammo, although they may have carried more if they knew they were going to fight. Later in the war, squad leaders would carry MP-38 9mm submachine guns, but this wasn't enacted at the time, and there isn't any indication that the Germans used SMGs during the assault. The machine gunner carried an MG-34 general-purpose machine gun, chambered in the same 7.92 caliber, but feeding with 50-round belt drums and firing at around 850 rounds per minute. This was the main firepower for the squad, and when deploying they generally were near the front of the formation, suppressing the enemy while the rest of the squad could maneuver. The importance of this role is underscored by the fact that 3 other men were assigned to assist the machine gunner. While 2 of these men were equipped with rifles along with replacement barrels and extra ammo, the main MG assistant carried most of the ammo, as many as 600 rounds, and was only equipped with a pistol along with the machine gunner. This would have either been the standard issue Walther P38 or the older, less reliable Luger P08. Both handguns were chambered in 9mm and fired from 8-round magazines. M24 stick grenades were carried by the rifle-carrying men as well, either 1 or 2, and the squad leader carried a smoke grenade variant. Rifle grenades were used as well, likely less sophisticated and without the dedicated launcher that would appear later in the war. For specialized weapons, the Germans had access to the Flammenwerfer 35, which had an effective range of about 25 meters and over 3 gallons of fuel. While not effective in open battle, the flamethrowers were very good for clearing entrenched enemy positions at close range. These were generally used by Pioneer Corps, who were specialized units who were trained in explosives and demolition use. Stationary units may have used the MG-08 Maxim heavy machine gun. Water-cooled, this HMG was chambered in 7.92 and could fire 500 rounds per minute from 250-round belts. Its 28.4-inch barrel gave it an effective range of about 2,000 meters. On the initial attack on Westerplatte, it is said that the Germans utilized a 20mm autocannon, likely a Flak 30. Primarily an anti-aircraft gun, the Flak 30 could fire 280 20 by 138mm explosive rounds in a minute, very effective even against ground targets. The relative lightweight and wheels of the piece also made it possible to move without a terrible amount of effort. The Danzig police were likely armed similarly, minus the flak gun, although not with the same organization or even uniforms. Artillery support from 210 and 105mm howitzers was utilized later, as well as mortars. For naval support, the MSK was primarily supported by the SMS Schleswig-Holstien battleship led by Vice Admiral Gustav Kleikamp, the most senior man at Westerplatte. At over 400 feet long and almost 13,000 tons of displacement, the ship was staffed by 596 men and was protected by 9.4-inch thick armor. The ship's primary armament was 4 11-inch guns, as well as 10 5.9-inch guns, 4 3.5-inch AA guns, and 4 1.5-inch guns. Two other ships, the minesweeper M107 and torpedo boat T196, would join the fighting later and were armed with 2 4.1 and 3.5-inch guns respectively. From the air, Junkers Ju-87B Stuka dive bombers were the weapon of choice for the Germans. Operated by 2 men, a pilot and a rear gunner, the Stuka was known for its menacing whines as it descended onto its target, flying past it, then barrel rolling into a dive before releasing the bomb at low altitude, as low as 1,500 feet, greatly increasing its accuracy. Its signature noise was the result of a specially made Jericho trumpet mounted on its undercarriage, which did a great job of instilling fear into the enemy. For armament, the Stuka was equipped with a rear 7.92 machine gun, 2 forward-facing machine guns of the same make, which were generally necessary due to its slow speed of about 211 miles per hour. But its main damage dealers were its bombs. Normally, it could carry 1 550-pound bomb along with 4 110-pound bombs at once, but with the rear gunner vacant, which may have happened at Westerplatte due to the low air threat of the Polish Air Force, it could carry 1 1,100-pound bomb. The Poles at Westerplatte, meanwhile, were outnumbered and outgunned. Likely abandoning any squad-level organization, they were split into different-sized groups and support networks. It is also very difficult to find information on Polish squad-level organization, and given that it likely wasn't used at Westerplatte, we will not be looking at that too much here. The weapons of the Poles, however, are more well-known, if not more complex. At the Republic's inception 21 years earlier, the Polish military was a mess, as different weapons, doctrines, and command structures were used by the 3 powers that Poland was reformed out of. Mannlichers, Mausers, and Mosins were all used by Polish troops, along with allied weapons from the West, but with time the Poles standardized, often licensing foreign weapons or creating their own models altogether. By the time of Westerplatte, the Polish army had decided on standard-issue weapons, although older weapons were still kept in reserves. These older weapons likely were used during the battle to some degree, since Westerplatte was fundamentally a logistics center and not a frontline fighting position, therefore having low priority in upgraded armament. The main battle rifle of the Polish army was the Karbinek Wzór 29, yes, even the rifle names are difficult in Polish, a Polish rifle heavily based off of the Kar 98K. Being developed in old German arms factories, the rifle was almost a knockoff of the Mauser, firing the same round with the same feeding, and having an almost identical barrel length of 24 inches. Its older, longer variant, the Wzór 98, and German Mausers, French Berthiers, and British Lee Enfields may also have been used as well. The Poles used the Model 1924 bayonet, pretty much an identical version of the German one. For pistols, the Poles had developed the Radom Wiz-35, a 9mm handgun heavily based on early versions of the Browning High Power and using an 8-round magazine. Of course, German P08s and P38s may have been used as well, and perhaps Browning 1922s, which were known to be used in other parts of the coastal fighting. The standard light machine gun for the Polish military was the Browning Wzór 1928, licensed from Belgium and later rightfully pirated by Poland, long story. Very similar to the American BAR, the Wzór 28 fired the 7.92 cartridge at 600 rounds per minute and was upgraded with a pistol grip, flash hider, and lighter bipod. However, it only used a 20-round box magazine, which was good for mobile battle rifle style movement shooting, but terrible for use in entrenched positions. For that, the The Poles mostly relied on the CKM Vjor 30, a knockoff of the American M1917 water-cooled heavy machine gun. The Vjor 30 was chambered in 7.92 and had a longer barrel than its American counterpart at 28 inches. Firing at 600 rounds a minute, the machine gun was fed with 330 round belts. The German MG08, very similar to this, may have been used as well. For grenades, the Poles likely used the Pineapple Vjor 33 defensive grenade, which granted a shrapnel radius of about 100 meters, making it necessary to throw from a protected position, as you may guess. The smaller egg-shaped Vjor 24 offensive grenade may have been used as well. For heavier weaponry, the Poles had three types of weapons. The first was a lone 76.5mm Armata field gun, dubbed by Poland the Vjor 0226. The 76.5mm could fire over 10 shells a minute, as far as 5 miles, with the rounds having an incapacitating radius of about 10 meters. The gun was actually not yet calibrated, and under better circumstances would have become a 75mm gun, which is what most sources say it is, but newer research actually debunks this. Bofors 37mm anti-tank guns were used as well, with similar rates of fire and mobility, but with a much smaller blast radius closer to 5 meters. For indirect fire, the defenders of Westerplatte used the Brandt MLE 2731 81mm mortar, more mobile and powerful than the other two weapons. Sporting a range of about a mile, the mortar rounds could inflict casualties easily within 30 meters of impact. Quickly comparing the armaments, we see that on the infantry level, the Poles and Germans were relatively similar, and both had similar rifles capable of firing easily out to 500 meters, with the only significant difference being machine guns. The Germans, both here and throughout the war, opted to use a single general-purpose weapon that was mobile enough to be used in squads, but also had significant firepower. The Poles, meanwhile, had a dual-gun approach, using the BAR as a very light, mobile weapon along with a more effective yet stationary heavy machine gun. As for force sizes, we once again see the lopsidedness. For infantry, the Germans had at least 1,725 men, 1,500 Danzig SS, and 225 Marines, as well as an unknown number of Danzig police, perhaps in the high tens or low hundreds, for a total of perhaps 1,800 to 2,000 fighting infantrymen. This is not including crews for artillery or on the ship or planes or anything. The Germans were supported by the battleship Schleswig-Holstien, 60 Stuka dive bombers, a 30mm flak gun, and an unknown amount of field artillery support from other areas. Pioneer troops also came in later, but these would have been small in number and just there for the use of sapping and flamethrowers. The Poles, meanwhile, had a force of just over 200 men, with 182 confirmed soldiers at the depot, as well as a couple dozen civilians and professional soldiers who happened to be on base at the time. These men were led by Major Henryk Szukarski, along with his second-in-command, Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski. Rifles were thought to have been in short supply, with only 100 or 60 so on base, but 18 heavy machine guns and 22 lighter machine guns were used. For heavy weapons, the Poles had a lone 76.5mm gun, 2 Bofors 37mm guns, and 4 81mm mortars. But while the Poles were hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered, they were very well prepared, a fact that the Germans did not account for. Westerplatte itself was a small peninsula, roughly a lobe, and about a mile long and a third as wide, only 0.6 kilometers square. The western side of Westerplatte was indented by an ammo port, taking up about a quarter of the island's length. To the southeast, the peninsula connected to the mainland of Danzig along a spit of land about 200 yards across. Along the south, the port canal separated it from the mainland with another 200 yards of water. A jetty also protruded from Westerplatte's northwest corner. For terrain, a few rises on the peninsula ran along its southern coast. A beach ran along the north coast, and forest covered most of the rest of the depot, save for developed areas. For infrastructure, the western side of the island was mostly taken up by the port and warehouses around it, supported by cranes and a power plant to keep it all running. Railway lines ran the length of Westerplatte along its northern spine, and these ran by ammo warehouses, each surrounded on three sides by earthen berms to prevent cook-offs and chain reactions. The center of the island was developed as well, with roads and a lawn, as well as a few buildings. On the southern end of the central area was yet another ammo bunker with a 2-vault berm, and to its east was the officers' casino, which had historically housed visitors to the peninsula when it was a spa. Old barracks for the soldiers were in the middle of the developed area, and a newer barracks building to the west rounded out the main structures. On the eastern end of Westerplatte there was a train station, and along the east and south of the depot there was a brick wall. Various bunkers left over from the German era were on Westerplatte as well, notably on the southeast and north coast roads, although they were in other places as well, and soldiers reported that their presence made digging fortifications more difficult. The Danzig port on the south was industrialized and housed various buildings, including a lighthouse, a grain elevator, and various warehouses. Since the ramp-up of tensions in 33 and then in 39, the Poles had fortified the island. On the eastern approach, the woods had been thinned out to allow for good fields of fire, and tank traps and barbed wire had been set. Barbed wire had also been set around the depot's port. 2 rings of defense had been prepared on the island. The first consisted of 7 positions, mostly made up of trenches and wire traps in the woodline, named Wał, Prom, Dik, Brzestan, Elektrowina, Łazienki, and Fort, the last of these actually being in an old German bunker. Past these positions were the second ring of defense, made up of newly constructed concrete bunkers numbered 1 through 5. A barbed wire line ran between these positions as well. The central buildings played a part as well, especially the new barracks, which was also called Guardhouse 6 and served as the command and control of the whole operation. The Polish artillery was scattered throughout the island. The main 76.5mm gun, kept in a warehouse until the battle, would be moved into a position on the west of the island, looking south, sheltered somewhat by 2 hills. One of the Bofors guns was kept near the train tracks to the north, while the other was in the inner ring near the old barracks. The mortars were positioned in an alcove next to the new barracks. Every feasible approach was protected by at least 2 fields of heavy machine gun fire, and the buildings had been equipped for mounting guns, especially in the basement levels, where they had concealed positions through peepholes disguised as vents. Minutes after the first bombs fell on Tczew, at 4:48 a.m., the guns of the Schleswig-Holstien erupted, sounding off the first direct fire engagement of the war. But despite the full force of a battleship coming to bear on the island, minimal damage was actually done, since the ship was too close to its target and the high explosive shells did not have time to arm, instead simply putting large holes in the ground and leveling trees. Some of the fire was very near the Marines as well, but an opening on the eastern wall was made, allowing the Marines through. Szukalski at the time radioed his famous message, "SOS, I'm under fire," to the nearby Hell base miles away. The Polish soldiers, expecting an attack given the not-so-subtle orientation of the battleship's guns, readied at their stations despite some initial surprise in the moment. Many soldiers later reported being excited, and the start of the conflict broke the dread that had been hanging over their heads for days. Quote, "The mood is magnificent. After so many hours of tension, calm at last." Some Polish soldiers even complained about wanting to test their machine guns and grew impatient that they couldn't test them on the Germans. This was about to change. At 4:46, 8 minutes later, the German Marines pushed into the southeast of Westerplatte. The first combat casualty of the war, Polish Staff Sergeant Wojciech Nysadek, was killed here, likely by an MG-34, as he fled from the railway station towards the Polish lines. The 225 men advanced about 220 yards and engaged with outpost Prom, but the other Polish positions at Wau, Fort, and Guardhouse 2 opened fire, catching them in an ambush. Quote, "Finally, at the right moment, at Lieutenant Peyong's command, our machine guns burst into a furious croak like angry dogs that had been held in chains. Our abrupt and exceptionally accurate fire ravaged the ranks of the attackers from a close distance. Dismay and hesitation are visible among the enemy. The first lines waver. The whole momentum of the attack breaks down. The defenders' hearts are joyous and uplifted." Initial German fire was inaccurate given their surprise and their movement, but soon they settled into stationary positions and became more accurate. The Germans launched rifle grenades, and it is said that they had accidentally brought inert practice variants. Despite losing the first soldier of the war, the Poles kept the advantage. Still outnumbered, they had the element of surprise and fortification, and the Germans were largely caught in the open, having to deal with barbed wire traps and hidden enemies. According to Corporal Edmund Shamlewski, quote, "At first, the Germans were stunned. They hadn't expected such a reception. Then they lost their self-control. Their nerves snapped. We could hear them calling, 'Mein Gott! Wasser! Hilfe!' The dead and wounded laid by the railroad tracks. The others, after this failed attack, were seeking cover and they began to shoot at us more accurately. As they fired, they hit a wasp nest. That was all we needed. Not only enemy fire, but wasps. The wasps were much more precise than the enemy." Meanwhile, German and Danzig machine gun positions from across the canal opened fire on the south of the depot. Around 5:15, the 75mm gun of the defenders came online, firing on the advancing Germans as well as the opposing machine gun nests. The Bofors guns and Polish mortars joined the fight, even firing on the German battleship. A detachment of Danzig police tried to cross Westerplatte at the mouth of the port, but this was repulsed as well. At 6:22, after an hour of fighting, the Germans retreated from Westerplatte, sustaining about 50 casualties to the Polish 8, although most of these were not deaths on either side. The first skirmish of the war was won by the Poles, but the battle was far from over. At 7:40, the Schleswig-Holstien fired upon Westerplatte again, this time for 75 minutes and at a closer range, knocking out the field gun and likely forcing the abandonment of outpost Prom. While the bombardment was still happening, the Germans along with the Danzig SS attacked again, but were once again repulsed by Wau, Fort, Dieck, and guardhouses 1, 2, and 5. Tripping over barbed wire and being cut down as they left. The MSK commander was wounded in the stomach and would later die from this assault. At 12:30, the Germans had retreated and dug into positions at the nearby Mevi ramparts, and air support was impossible due to bad weather. The first day of battle went to the Poles, who had succeeded in killing 16 Germans and wounding over half of the MSK, while only suffering 5 deaths. The Germans took the next few hours to strategize, while the Poles rested and withdrew from outpost Wau and Prom to more sustainable positions at Fort and the guardhouses. The Germans were heavily surprised by this defeat. It had been said by Danzig officers that they could take the peninsula very quickly, but now, upon re-examination, the Germans believed that the Poles had developed an entire fortress system with tunnels, which was not true. Now convinced that the Poles had immense defenses, the Germans aimed to soften them up. At 6:05 p.m. on the 2nd of September, 2 waves of Stuka bombing runs totaling 60 planes descended on the island. For 30 minutes, the planes pounded the depot and managed to destroy the mortars, water system, and radio, as well as scoring 2 direct hits on Guardhouse 5, causing a cook-off and exploding the entire building, killing 8 of the Poles who had been there. A soldier described the aftermath of the raid, quote, "The terrain had been turned into a moonscape full of craters, knocked down trees, and incendiary bombs still aflame on the meadow in front of the barracks. It is said that the Poles may have briefly waved a white flag at this point, but this is unconfirmed. Nevertheless, the bombing took a massive toll on the Polish morale. Szukalski, despite being a seasoned veteran, is believed to have succumbed to some combination of drunkenness and acute stress disorder, a precursor to PTSD, from the bombing, and became incapable of command. For the rest of the siege, his second-in-command, Captain Franciszek Dąbrowski, effectively commanded the Polish forces. Some Poles also tried to surrender, and 4 men may have been executed for attempted desertion sometime after the raids. The next day was slower, with the Germans setting up artillery nearby and the lighter naval vessels taking up positions to the north. To fortify the hole in the line after the destruction of Guardhouse 5, the mortar crews were recycled into a new fighting position by ammo warehouses 12 through 15 under Commander Bajnasz. Good news was on the horizon, however, as England and France declared war on Germany on this day in solidarity with Poland. Help was on the way, even if it would be too late for Westerplatte. On the night of the 3rd, more German infantry attacks were launched, but the well-designed fields of fire, concealing forest, and fortified positions kept the Germans from making much ground. Quote, "Inside, the shells are buzzing around like bees. They rip the sandbags open, leaving the defenders exposed to enemy fire. We toss hand grenades. When all is lost, Diek's and Binaszek's group come to our aid with machine guns, sweeping the attackers with flanking fire and from the back. It is likely around this time that the attackers managed to gain a foothold on the island and dig into defensive fortifications, if not take over the abandoned Polish positions. During the day of the 4th, the newly arrived smaller German vessels opened fire, but did little in the way of damage, given that they were firing on the north side of the island. However, the Poles were on their last legs. Water was running out, and the wounded could not be adequately cared for, destroying morale of the fighters, to say nothing of the victims themselves. Elements of the German Pioneer Corps from East Prussia arrived in the battle as well, with flamethrowers. At 9 a.m. on September 5th, the German artillery opened fire on Westerplatte, and while it did little damage, the Polish morale sunk even lower. Szukalski lobbied the others to surrender, but this was rebuked and the Poles held out. That night, the German infantry attack resumed, this time with the help of a train car filled with fuel. The Germans hoped to drive the flammable cargo to explode in the Polish positions and burn down the forest, which gave them cover, but this failed either because the conductor decoupled early or the Poles incapacitated the train. A fire started near the German lines, but this did not spread to the trees due to the humidity and only served to illuminate yet another wave of German infantry, which was beaten back as the Germans hastily put out the fire. The same tactic would be tried again later, but once again the Germans failed since the Poles had destroyed the rails and renewed firing on the train. Through the 6th, German mortars would bombard Westerplatte, but to little effect. Quote, "The guardhouse trembles convulsively and wobbles. We are buried with no air to breathe, the ventilator damaged, the fan broken. We are almost breathless. We fear the Germans use gas, so we put gas masks on. The earth shakes. We hear clangor above our heads. Probably the rest of the guardhouse has collapsed. Shrapnel and rubble are blown in through a breach in the wall. Our only protection is a concrete partition. Our machine guns are bent and twisted, and it is quiet outside." At 4:30 a.m. on the 7th, the Germans attacked once more, with the Schleswig-Holstien barraging the depot for 30 minutes, until the infantry advanced once again with machine gun support from across the water. The pioneer troops deployed flamethrowers and further ate away at the morale and position of the Poles. The battleship even destroyed Guardhouse 2 during the ensuing battle without casualties, but fire from Fort Biniash, Ditka, and Guardhouse 1 prevailed, and the Germans once again had to retreat at 7 a.m. Throughout these skirmishes, the Germans steadily pushed up and gained more and more ground, getting closer and closer to the Polish positions, and may have even gotten within a couple hundred yards of the internal line of defense. Surprisingly, the Germans tried the fire train tactic again, but unsurprisingly, it failed once again. This, however, would be the final battle. The Poles were demoralized. They had been assigned to fight for 12 hours, and they had gone long past that point. France and Britain had declared war days before, but no help from the Allies came either. The defenders were low on ammo, and the wounded started to get gangrene, an issue that the undersupplied lone doctor of Westerplatte could not fix. According to Chmielewski, quote, "The wounded needed calm, but here, as if in mockery, booms, quakes, and explosions came from all sides, and they lay idly, listening to the moaning of their wounded comrades in the defense. Plus, Prom, Vau, and guardhouses 2 and 5 were gone, and guardhouses 1 and 4 were damaged. The defense was compromised, and at 9:45, the Polish commanders finally agreed with Szukalski and surrendered the depot, waving a white flag from the barracks window." After 7 days of fighting, the small depot was captured. It is thought that 19 Polish fighters died, about half of them from the Stuka bombings, while the Germans and Danzigers suffered about 50 dead. The surrendering Poles were treated relatively well in contrast to the fate of their nation. Major Szukalski was even temporarily allowed to keep his Ceremonia Szabla, and the Germans respected their prisoners as brave fighters. These men would temporarily be imprisoned in the very same fortress that the Germans had initially taken shelter in. The exception to this, sadly, was the depot's radio operator, who was tortured and killed for not divulging Polish radio codes. Poland's plight would only worsen as on the 17th, the Soviet Union would invade Poland from the east. Soon after the battle, Polish prisoners were put to work on Westerplatte, and on the 21st, Hitler himself actually visited the depot, somewhat miffed, yet perhaps impressed at the defenders' ability to hold out for so long. 6 days later, Warsaw was captured by the Germans, but fighting still went on, including at the nearby Hel Peninsula, which put up stiff resistance until October 2nd. On the 6th of October, Poland finally was conquered by the partitioning powers, although legally, Poland had never surrendered, and the survivors of the Polish government and military fled abroad and continued to work with resistance groups in the country as well as the Allied powers throughout the war. Nevertheless, World War II was disastrous for Poland. The defense at the borders had been easily pierced, and German blitzkrieg tactics, which had failed at Westerplatte, succeeded in the rest of the country, encircling massive numbers of soldiers while also targeting civilian populations. Pomerania had been disproportionately affected in this regard. Poland's attitude towards its allies, sadly, was not pessimistic enough. While Poland had assumed her allies would give Germany some concessions, she at least thought that France and England would actually do something. And save for a half-hearted 9-day campaign by the French, the Allies did nothing to help Poland. After partition, Poland would be center stage for some of the worst of World War II. The first German concentration camp would be founded at Stutthof, not 20 miles from Westerplatte. In 1941, the first action of Operation Barbarossa would play out on Polish land before it ever got to the USSR. And of course, the Holocaust would decimate Poland's Jewish population, killing 3 million Jews in the country alone, half of all in the Holocaust, and about 90% of Poland's pre-war population. An additional 3 million Poles would be killed in the war, mostly civilians. Polish resistance movements would continue throughout the war, although their efforts were largely unsuccessful. At the close of the conflict, Soviet troops would occupy Poland, while millions of Germans were driven from their homes or killed. Poland's borders would shift, with Stalin taking the eastern regions for the USSR, and Poland receiving territory from East Germany, as well as the former Free City. Gdańsk itself was not spared, and in 1945, 90% of the city was destroyed by the Soviets, while Westerplatte saw combat once more between Germans and Soviets. After the war, the Germans who remained in Gdańsk were discriminated against and encouraged to leave, while the whole of Poland was ruled by a communist puppet government who often persecuted and executed Poland's freedom fighters that had fought during the war. The war was an unmitigated disaster for Poland, despite a bevy of heroic last stands at Hell, Warsaw, and of course, Westerplatte. On the strategic and tactical levels, Westerplatte was rather unimportant. To be fair, it diverted an inordinate amount of German troops and resources for a week, likely slowing some of the progress on other fronts in Pomerania. That being said, Pomerania was lost anyway. It was inevitable. Westerplatte did not defend an important location, nor could it be a staging ground for Polish offensives in the German rear. There were too few soldiers, too little firepower, and no way of escape or resupply. While the depot may have harried nearby German positions, the Germans could probably have just ignored Westerplatte altogether and come back for it after the region was conquered, or even just wait for them to run out of food. Instead, Westerplatte's significance was symbolic for both sides. For the Germans, especially those in Danzig, Westerplatte was a reminder of the Polish abomination. Their proud empire had been carved up after World War I, and the very existence of Poland was a painful reminder of this. Westerplatte was 2 bridges too far, as it was a military installation on free Danzig land. By taking the depot, the Germans were erasing that painful reminder and solidly winning over the Danzig population. The failure to take it quickly, however, was symbolic as well. The Germans certainly recognized this, as evidenced by the fact that Hitler himself came to visit the site of what was effectively the first temporary German defeat. The Poles, of course, saw the resistance at Westerplatte as significant as well. During the first week of the war, radio broadcasts would announce that Westerplatte fights on, and the whole battle there was a microcosm of the wider Polish struggle. The resistance was somewhat useless, and the defenders knew that, yet they fought on. They could have surrendered quickly and would have been totally justified even in the eyes of the Polish High Command, who only asked for 12 hours. So if a group of isolated Poles could fight a force 10 times their size and wildly better equipped, what could the other Polish resistance fighters do? The microcosm of Westerplatte also applies, perhaps in a less rosy way, to the wider Polish resistance efforts after the invasion. At Hell and later Warsaw, the Poles did amazing work with what they had. Lightly armed and outnumbered fighters set the German military back on their heels and had far more initial success than they ever should have had. To this day, these examples of resistance are good to study for those who are interested in asymmetric defense or offense against a powerful enemy, but ultimately their efforts would fail and their pride was all they had to show for it. After the war, Westerplatte was unique in how it was commemorated. Under the communist regime, Polish resistance to the Germans was mostly celebrated as a collaboration with Soviets in the closing years of the war. Earlier uprisings and the initial resistance were seen as supportive of a bourgeois government, and of course the whole part about the USSR teaming up with the Nazis to invade Poland was just swept under the rug. But Westerplatte was an exception. In the 1960s, the 75-foot tower that remains today was erected in honor of the soldiers, and efforts were taken to preserve the fighting positions, including an innovative solution to physically move Guardhouse 1 out of the way of the new port being made on the peninsula. All this being said, wasn't a total victory in terms of preservation, as the communist government insisted on replacing the cross that commemorated with the graves with a tank, and of course the peninsula itself was altered, with the aforementioned port and southern coast being whittled away to widen the canal. Today, the northwestern section of Westerplatte is home to the customs control station, making parts of the historic battlefield inaccessible. The new barracks, or Guardhouse 6, also still stands today, although it is largely destroyed, mostly from deterioration after the war. But perhaps the most symbolic element of Westerplatte is that it was the first battle of the war. For a couple minutes at Westerplatte, only one soldier had been killed in World War II, and the fact that this site was the beginning of such a climactic, if horrendous, chapter in history captures the imagination. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. I know this isn't the battle I was supposed to cover next. I'm going in chronological order with Creasy's things, and no, this is not on Creasy's list. But since I was in Poland, I thought that it would be great to do. Anyways, let me know what you thought of this. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.